So we've seen an example of a component. Now, one thing we might want to do is to go ahead and have some sort of state. So one thing to notice about this is it is a pure function here, in that every time we call this with the same props, it's going to return the same value. Let's go ahead and create a clock. Okay, so we're going to have two instances of a clock. So our clock is going to take in some properties, and then it's going to just return, let's say, some text. So say props dot date. So that means we need to pass in the date. So let's just pass that in. So we can say date equals the current date. Let's see how that looks. So we can see we do have the current time, and that's great. And as we'd expect, it's the same time, but it's not updating. So we want it to update. Well, we don't want to keep recalling this app function to somehow cause it to re-render. Instead, we're going to go ahead and remove the date from a property and make it state of the clock. So basically, your data for a component can either come from the parent via property, and that's normally what you want. But there are some cases where you want to have internal state. And let's look at how we do that. Okay. So what we do is we use what's called useState. So useState takes a parameter that we pass in. Okay. The parameter we pass in is initial value. So our initial value in this case is the current date. And then what it returns is two values. Okay, so it returns you a pair. The first is the current value of that state information we have. So let's call that the date. And the second is something that allows you to set the date. So it's returning this pair as an array, and then we're using this array destructuring. So that means we can just go ahead and use the date. So let's just look at it just like this for right now, okay, with making no changes. So we are going to say our initial value is whatever the current date is. That is what date gets set to, and then we're going to use it. We save this. Okay, so our problem here is our useState. It's saying it's not a function. We need to actually use curly braces around here. And so now it's just saying we haven't used setDate, and that's to be expected. So let's go take a look. And yes, it's still showing the current time. Now the key is if we call setDate, we can now update the value of the date. So let's look at a simplified way to do that that's not 100% accurate. Okay, we'll go ahead and set a timeout. Set a timeout. So we first add in a callback. So our callback is going to be called so it's no arguments. We're going to use our arrow syntax here. And what do we want to do in here? Well, what we want to do is call setDate with whatever now the current date is. So the date after some timeout has happened. And when do we want to do that? We'll just say in 1,000 milliseconds. Okay. So this is going to say every 1,000 milliseconds, it's going to go ahead and update setDate. Let's try that. And we see it's updating every second, which is great. Okay. Now we have two separate instances of clock, which are independent of one another. Now we do have a little bit of a problem, and that is fairly minor, but we should probably fix it. And so we should look at how to fix it, and that is, let's say a clock goes away. So let's say we have two clocks now, and then in future we get rid of one of these clocks. Well, it's still got a timeout going that's going to fire, and we don't really want that to happen. So we need to somehow clear this timeout. Okay? And the way we clear this timeout is we go ahead and use something different, which is useEffect. So useEffect is going to get called. So we should go ahead and import this. So we pass in a function, okay? And that function is going to be called basically every time after we render this clock, okay? So what we're going to, so this gets called. And what we want to do is, when it gets called, we want to set the timeout. So this is basically the same thing we had before, but call set timeout. Great, what's the difference? Well, the difference is, well, first off, set timeout, we should look. It returns a timer. Okay, and that timer can be used to unregister this timeout so that this callback will no longer be called. So what we will do is we actually return, so in useEffect, it gets called at the beginning of every render, and it returns a function, and after the rendering, so what happens is this function is going to get called when this component goes away. Okay. Or when this component has just re-rendered. So the first one, all this code gets called, that is this outer function, gets called after we've rendered. It sets up the timeout to ensure that it will set the date, and that'll cause a re-render. So after we call setDate, any of these set functions for state, then they cause this component to re-render. So basically, if the props change or the state changes, then this will automatically re-render. So we're causing the state to change by calling setDate. We need to do the clear timeout. Again, in the normal circumstance, we'll be fine, right? We've got a clock and it's going off. So what happens? We render, we set the timeout for a second later. And then a second later, our timer goes off. So our timer goes off, and what happens? It executes this code. And what does this code do? It calls setDate. SetDate changes the state, and so it's going to cause us to re-render. Because we're about to re-render, it's going to call this effect routine, what we returned from useEffect, and clear out the timeout. Now, clearing out the timeout is kind of useless because the timer already happened, right? We got here because we're re-rendering, and we're re-rendering because we called setDate. But in the case where we rendered our component, the timeout is waiting to happen, and then our component goes away for some reason, right? Because our parent decides they don't need us anymore. Then we're no longer going to execute this code. Or rather, we do no longer want to execute this code. And so therefore, we're not going to re-render, we're not going to render anymore. Our component goes away, and so it calls this cleanup function, which will clear the timeout, and which will then ensure that this one is not going to get called. Let's look at adding a property here, right? Let's look at actually adding a update frequency. So we'll update this one every second, and we'll update this one every 5 seconds. So props.frequency is going to tell us, so let's just change this, props.frequency. And let's look. So this is 12:06:16, And that's not working, so let's look and see what's happening. And it's because we misnamed it. So let's call it update frequency. So this one's updating every second, and this one's updating 47, 52, 57 correctly every 5 seconds. So this is our use of state.